Alrighty, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master's Soapbox. Today we are going to be looking at the secrets that players keep. And this isn't just players, but players and characters, and I'll explain a little bit why there would be a difference between those two. But the secrets that players keep from the Game Master. And while it doesn't seem logical to have any of those, nonetheless, there are several areas wherein the players decisions are kept to themselves and in some cases actually can change the flavor of the game sessions uh, completely. So we're going to be looking at those. And so before you do that, make sure you click all the buttons down below so that the algorithm will know that you're part of our audience. All right, let's get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so when we talk about role-play games and the secrets that players keep, what are we talking about? The idea of playing a role play game is, after all, a exchange of information. So, what kind of information could a player possibly keep away from the game master, and what would be their motive in doing so? That's what we're going to look at today. So, let's get right to it. Now, this may seem illogical, but players occasionally will keep to themselves their actual stats, whatever attributing marks or abilities that they have, or even numerics of how many hit points they have or whatever. And it seems illogical that they would do this, but the reason that players, I believe one of the reasons that players keep this apart is that they are somehow subconsciously aware that the game master is gauging the activities of the villains and the encounters based on the numerics of the players. This was early on as a game master. You really want to do everything you can to keep the players' characters alive in your game, and so you naturally want to goaltend for them. And by that I mean you start with a conflict with a monster or a creature, and there's a whittling down of the hit points of the players. But the amount of damage that your villains do becomes, especially when you're kind of a novice at it, they can be, massive amounts of points of damage at first, but as you are tracking their hit points, somehow your monsters seem to do less damage per attack in later engagement, later parts of the rounds of combat. And players, of course, want to feel the risk, want to feel the danger, but they also want you to play it straight with them. In other words, the monster, if the monster does successfully hit, then the monster does whatever damage that he does, and the GMs that are trying to goaltend become obvious to the players in relatively short order, because the players can simply watch it happen. And it's one of those things where the game master feels like he's doing a good job of keeping the adventure going. But if it's the point where the dice don't really matter, now the players are going to be frustrated and somewhat annoyed. And so they'll actually start hiding, or not so much hiding, but just not announcing where they are in the hit point pool and things like this. Now, this is probably coming from my age, but many of the younger game masters don't have this problem because they are playing the game literally the way a video game would work. And if a character dies, just get a new one, and there's not as much goaltending going on as there used to be, I don't suppose. But the reasons for this lack of trust are twofold. The game master himself is trying to goaltend and protect the players in the game sessions, even though he's the one who presented the threats in the first place. And on the other hand, the players have only begun to realize that this is the situation. And Therefore, it's problematic because now there is a distrust building up between the player and his group. Now, having GM'd for as long as I have, I know that there are times when a game master's desire to goaltend becomes untenable or problematic, and sometimes you get a wake-up call because your players, call you out on it or challenge you on it, or conversely, they stop playing and you don't know why. And this is one of the preliminary reasons why a player would cease playing a game if there's a lack of trust in the game master's playing straight of the game. This also applies to the idea of expendables. When you are looking at your number of arrows or number of darts or whatever as you're going through the game and you realize you're becoming low on them, or conversely, you've never really tracked them before, when the game master starts to ask, how many arrows do you have left, it's a bit of overture by the game master to try to, again, goaltend, try to keep the players in the game by making sure that they have the resources, but it doesn't come off that way. It comes off as, oh boy, I'm going to run you out of arrows, and now I'm really going to get you. And this builds that player versus game master aspect that it inherently happens in games groups, but it isn't necessarily intentional, nor is it nefarious in any way. But nonetheless, the players feel that fear, and so therefore they start to either hedge their numbers, or perhaps they haven't been tracking, and ultimately here's a secret from behind the screen. It really doesn't matter if you want the players to be able to attack, don't question it. But on the other hand, if you are concerned with, for example, an overt push, wherein you've been in 8 rounds of combat in the last hour, and how many arrows do they have left, becomes problematic. But a game master who depends on the players to track their own expendables does lend itself to a lack of disclosure, shall we say. And I'm not saying that these are secrets that the players are keeping for the purpose of being untrustworthy or for challenging the game master's story, but it's simply a defense mechanism that people develop when the situation seems to threaten them, because ultimately we don't want it to be our fault if something bad happens, and so we tend to shy away from communicating the truth. Now, again, most groups you don't ever have this come up because we do a lot of, as a game master say, hand-wavium over subjects and just let it flow. But sometimes, especially if you're playing a really hardline, quote, realistic campaign, then these numbers really matter, and the lack of transparency does cause problems. The biggest challenge, in my estimation, is that players often hide their motivation from the game master. And this actually plays into what I think is one of the major elements of role-playing games that is satisfying, and that is when a player has an idea in his head. He gives as little description as he can, and then the game master somehow is able to interpret and provide a resolution that suits exactly what the player was trying to accomplish. And so it's really satisfying when that happens, when the game master asks the player for his action is described, the game master not only sees the die roll and sees the choices that the player has stated out loud, but he also interprets what would be the optimal outcome for that player and then feeds into it. So the problem is that when you've done something really successful as a storyteller and you've conveyed a response that elicits this really positive, euphoric response from your players, the next scene, they then are going to see whether they can replicate that by providing you with less information and see whether or not you can read their minds. And while it is a fun exercise to creatively try to work your way into the way your players are thinking as they go into a scene, eventually there will be times when it's a dissatisfactory response. In other words, you didn't read it quite right, or you read something into it that they did not intend, and the player interaction with you becomes stilted. They didn't get what they were looking for, and so now they're at a loss because they thought you understood them. And this process of processing is what leads to the players holding back information. And they're not doing so to do a gotcha on the game master. They're not trying to break the game mechanic. What they are trying to do is get that same emotional charge that they once got. And so it's a matter of really learning to ask the right questions. And quite often in games now, I have to actually stop and ask the player, what was it you were trying to accomplish? What is it you were looking for happening? Because they've gotten familiar enough with the way I describe things that they think they understand where that break point is, and then are frustrated when it doesn't occur. So it's really important that the players learn to establish in their description of what they're doing what they are expecting the scene to be like, so that the game master can appropriately adjust it or filter it as necessary to give them the response they're looking for. Now, that isn't to say you're going to be giving away the farm, so to speak, when referring to the information you give to players, but it does mean that you have to think like they think. You have to be considerate of where they are in the story, what they are perceiving, and what is the overarching reality versus what they are perceiving, to make sure that they are getting from you the story elements that they need to make the right decisions and to make coherent ones. And this awareness of the very processes of thought really does help a game master be what the players are looking for in each scene. Now, there will be times and events where there is situational disconnect. A player had to be away from the table for a moment, and when he comes back, he's not fully aware. Perhaps there was a narrative difficulty where you provided a description of something that the players literally did not know how to process that information. You either gave them a size description that doesn't make any sense, or you've given them a locational relevancy that doesn't seem to really work. So it's really important that the players prevent hiding these disconnects. And it's really dependent upon the game master to ensure that these are not in occurrence. And so my recommendation in those situations is to make sure that you restate the game state on a regular basis. In other words, update the players on where the creatures or monsters have moved to. Describe for them the physical things that they see, the resources they might be able to draw into the game that may not have been obvious. So items on tables, things that are leaning against the wall and such, so that they have a deeper understanding of what's going on, to avoid these situational disconnects that cause the game to kind of fall into a less than efficient mechanism as you're trying to fight to give that information back to them. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with actually saying, hold up, guys, I think we're missing something, and then restating the game state with any changes that have occurred since the last time, so that the players can continue to make their decisions and their calls about what they're going to do in a way that not only conveys information back to you, but makes it obvious that they understand the situation, so that there are no undiscoverable disconnects. Another item that occurs sometimes, and it's got nothing to do with the game master, or maybe it does, but the idea of interpersonal conflicts. Now, this has to do with everything away from the table and doesn't refer to anything that happens perhaps in the game, but the way someone feels discomfort in the presence of another player, or a situation that occurred earlier has not been yet resolved. These add to a player's overall discomfort. And when these things occur, perhaps you aren't even aware of it as a game master, but these can be problematic. So I believe one of the things that it's referred to in social interaction is the idea of I just lost the word. The idea that you reconnect or validate the current situation. Are you okay? Check-in. That's what I was looking for. The concept of the check-in. Are we okay? Is everything cool? Is something missing? Is there something you wanted to say? And in the case of interpersonal conflicts, these can sometimes be particularly problematic because the players really don't want to bring it up. They don't really want it made public, but they do feel this discomfort. And so it's very important that the game master makes a very comfortable environment for the players to be safe about these things. And even if it's a matter of stepping away from the table and attempting to resolve these things individually, it's important to not let them get in the way of the game, which means if there is a problem, it needs to be resolved, good or ill. There may be situations where players simply can't play at the same table with each other, even if it's only for a period of time. But that needs to be addressed, because what it leads to otherwise is the players simply leave the table and never come back, and you don't know why. So this interpersonal conflict could actually be with yourself. I've had players who, at some point were upset with something that happened, not in my game, but in something else in life, and they felt like they couldn't be at the table for a while, but they didn't want to announce it or address it because it's uncomfortable to resolve. Nonetheless, it's the best thing to get those situations isolated and identifiable so they can be resolved. Now, this one actually is more common than you might think, but on the other hand, not always as damaging as you might think. Someone who is dissatisfied with the game state might simply not understand a ruling that was made earlier in the game, or they feel like they were unjustly targeted in a particular engagement, or that you're being unreasonable in your assessment. And this dissatisfaction with the game state needs to be stated, because if you don't know that you've made a mistake, there's no way you can repair it. So the idea here is that, again, with the idea of restating the game state periodically, if a player's actions seem to be more isolating and more standoffish, it may be because there's a dissatisfaction with something that happened in the game, and it needs to be drawn out and explained. Whether this is done individually away from the table or whether it happens in the public eye so everyone can see it, that's a nuanced issue, because sometimes that's an easy to solve situation where it's just simply restating something that somebody missed, or it can be as complex as a player's decision was misinterpreted and your decisions as a game master were unjustified. And it is sometimes difficult, but then again, it is also quite important that the game master is able to say, you know what, I made a mistake. Let's back up to that particular moment and revise that. The very concept of the retcon is there for everybody to play with anyway, and simply being open enough to go back and resolve the situation to make sure it's to everyone's satisfaction is really important to keep a games group together. Because again, players, if they are uncomfortable or dissatisfied with the game experience, why would they even participate in it? And it causes players to literally leave tables, and that's like the worst thing that could possibly happen. And this one's surprising, in that players sometimes reach character fatigue. They've been playing a character for a number of weeks. Perhaps it could be 6 sessions, or it could be 2 years into a campaign, and suddenly they're just not feeling the connection with their character any longer, or the character himself has gotten to the point where he's done all the things he wanted to do, and now is a place where he wants to step away. And sometimes this is difficult for a player, especially those who are long tail players and have really invested in the campaign. They don't want to lose the connection, but they also don't feel happy with the situation concerning their character. And players will hide this or attempt to hide this, but the reality is that these kind of elements tend to boil forth in surprising ways in non-player character interactions, in resolution of combat or other places. Suddenly the player just isn't, the character is no longer reacting in the same way, and there's something going on. So it's important to bring this out as well, because sometimes it's okay for a character simply to resign, retire, move on with its life beyond the story that's been going on. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it's something that a game master really needs to be able to get his hands around, because players aren't their characters and characters aren't the player. And I know that's sometimes somewhat confusing, but the idea that a character is exhausted with the way things are going and wants to move on simply is something that the players sometimes can't express because they feel like they would be hurting the game. One of the biggest challenges is, of course, story confusion, and this can happen in a myriad of ways. Perhaps they miss a session, so therefore they're not on the same wavelength as everybody else. Perhaps the use of terms has become confusing. I've had situations where I've had to revise my vocabulary for my players because what I've described is not comprehensible, and maybe I'm just blathering, but the point is that sometimes a player's confusion will be hidden. It won't be overt because they are trying to get along, they're trying to work through it, and so they are simply acting on information that's not completely accurate, more than likely because they don't understand what's happened, or that they have lost the ball, perhaps, or even the mechanics of the game have shifted and there needs to be a change. So again, all of these elements can be hidden by the player, whether they mean to or not, on the basis of trying to keep the games group together. But if it continues, it could actually be a reason for someone to leave your game. And so we want to make sure to clear up any confusion and provide a deeper openness to the players. Ultimately, the underlying problem of tabletop roleplay games is that it is a game of verbalism. It's a matter of communication, and some people have differing levels of capacity. You have players who perhaps have a limited vocabulary in terms of the theme or the concept that you're in, and so when they describe things, it's a bit jolting and it causes confusion. Perhaps they don't understand or haven't a clue where you're taking the story, and that can be a problem. And the fact that sometimes you even are trying to carry forward a story when the players aren't having it can be itself a problem. And so there is a lot of introspection that a game master has to go through to make sure he's providing the best possible outcome for his players. These underlying problems that apply to tabletop roleplay games do lead to incidental, accidental, or intentional obstruction of the truth, or obstruction of the visuals, or the comprehension of the setting, scene, or staging. And the idea here is that the game master's obligation is to attempt to unravel these piece by piece, and arguably, the fewer of these you have, the smoother the game session. But the smooth game session can also itself belie the fact that their players are not satisfied, and so it's a matter of working together to make sure you avoid any of these secrets that you may be keeping either from your games group or the games group are keeping from you. I want to thank you for being here today. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been Nikos RPG. Make sure that you check out the rest of our videos. In particular, I have a playlist called Trends in the Telling, which give basically updates on what's going on in the games industry segment by segment.